Welcome, dear listeners, to the untamed frontier of the American West. In this chapter, we meet Lillian Hawthorne, a Boston beauty yearning for more than her gilded cage can offer. Little does she know, adventure awaits, and it's wearing chaps. Settle in and let the Wild West work its magic on you. Chapter 1. A Life Less Ordinary. The gentle tinkling of china cups and polite laughter filled the air of the Hawthornes' sunlit parlor. Lillian sat straight-backed in her chair, her emerald silk gown a stark contrast to the muted tones of the other ladies' attire. She smiled and nodded at the appropriate moments, but her gaze kept drifting to the window, where a robin hopped along the branch of a carefully manicured oak tree.
"Lillian, dear,"
her mother's voice cut through her reverie.
"Mrs. Astor was just asking about your thoughts on the upcoming debutante ball."
Lillian blinked, turning her attention back to the room.
"Oh, I'm sure it will be lovely,"
she replied, the words falling from her lips with practiced ease.
"The Astors always throw such grand affairs."
As the conversation drifted to the latest Paris fashions, Lillian's fingers itched for a book. Any book. Her eyes darted to the mahogany bookshelf across the room, filled with leather-bound volumes she'd read countless times, each one a window to a world beyond these gilded walls. The afternoon tea dragged on, a parade of idle chatter and thinly veiled social maneuvering. When the last guest finally departed, Lillian let out a small sigh of relief.
"You seem distracted today,"
her mother observed, arching a perfectly groomed eyebrow. Lillian smoothed her skirts, avoiding her mother's gaze.
"I suppose I'm a bit tired. If you'll excuse me, I think I'll retire to my room for a while before dinner."
In the sanctuary of her bedroom, Lillian's shoulders relaxed. She moved to her writing desk, pulling out a stack of letters hidden beneath a false bottom drawer. Each envelope bore the seal of various women's colleges: Vassar, Smith, Wellesley. Her fingers traced the embossed letters, a wistful smile tugging at her lips. A knock at the door startled her. Quickly, she shoved the letters back into their hiding place.
"Come in,"
she called, composing herself. Her father entered, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners.
"There's my girl. Your mother mentioned you weren't feeling well."
Lillian felt a pang of guilt at the concern in his voice.
"I'm fine, truly, just a bit of a headache."
He studied her for a moment, then pulled a folded newspaper from his jacket pocket.
"I thought this might interest you,"
he said, handing it to her with a conspiratorial wink. Lillian unfolded the paper, her eyes widening as she read the headline, "Teachers Needed in Western Territories. Adventure Awaits." Her heart raced as she skimmed the article, detailing the need for educated young women to bring knowledge to the frontier. Images flashed through her mind: wide-open spaces, children eager to learn, a life filled with purpose.
"Father,
She began, but he held up a hand.
"I know that look in your eye, Lily.
He said softly.
It's the same one I saw when you begged me for your first algebra book."
He paused, his expression a mixture of pride and concern.
"Just promise me you'll think carefully before making any decisions. The West isn't Boston."
Lillian nodded, clutching the newspaper to her chest. As her father left the room, she turned back to the window. The robin had long since flown away, but now Lillian's gaze stretched beyond the manicured lawns of Beacon Hill, towards an horizon she could only imagine. That night, as the Hawthorne family sat down to a lavish dinner, the clink of silver against fine china seemed to echo hollowly in Lillian's ears. She pushed her food around her plate, her mind filled with visions of dusty schoolrooms and endless prairies.
"Lillian,"
her mother's voice cut through her thoughts.
"the Stevenson's son, Charles, has asked permission to call on you next week. I've taken the liberty of accepting on your behalf."
Lillian's fork clattered against her plate.
"Mother,
"It's high time you started thinking seriously about your future."
Her mother continued, oblivious to Lillian's distress.
"Charles is a fine match. Harvard educated, from an excellent family."
As her mother extolled Charles's virtues, Lillian felt the walls of the dining room closing in. The crystal chandelier overhead seemed to dim, the flames of the candles on the table flickering like a silent cry for help. Later, as she lay in bed, Lillian's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. The newspaper article lay on her nightstand, its promises of adventure and purpose calling to her like a siren's song. She thought of the years stretching before her, an endless parade of tea parties, balls, and polite conversation, a life mapped out with exquisite precision, every step carefully choreographed. And yet, with a sudden burst of energy, Lillian threw back the covers and moved to her desk. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and dipped her pen in ink. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to write.
Dear Sir, I write in response to your advertisement for teachers in the Western Territories.
As the first rays of dawn crept through her window, Lillian sealed the envelope with a sense of both terror and exhilaration. Whatever came next, she knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same. Chapter 2. The Lone Rider. The first rays of dawn had barely touched the dusty streets of Sagebrush Creek when Wyatt Jameson rode into town. His stallion's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust, the only disturbance in the early morning quiet. Wyatt's keen eyes scanned the familiar buildings, noting the fresh coat of paint on the general store and the new hitching post outside the saloon. He dismounted with fluid grace, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the ground. A few early risers nodded in his direction, a mix of respect and wariness in their eyes. Wyatt tipped his hat in response, but didn't linger for conversation.
Morning, Mr. Jameson.
Called out young Tommy, the stable hand, as Wyatt approached the livery.
Heard you was out chasing them rustlers again.
Wyatt's hand instinctively moved to the worn wooden grip of his revolver.
News travels fast,
He muttered, leading his horse into the stable. Tommy trailed after him, eyes wide with admiration.
Did you catch him? Pa says you're the best tracker this side of the Mississippi.
A ghost of a smile flickered across Wyatt's face as he began unsaddling his horse.
Your pa talks too much?
He said, but there was no real bite to his words. His calloused hands moved with gentle efficiency, checking his mount for any signs of injury or fatigue.
But did you catch him?
Tommy persisted. Wyatt paused, his eyes taking on a distant look.
Sometimes it ain't about catching, Tommy. Sometimes it's about sending a message.
He pulled a folded wanted poster from his saddlebag, handing it to the boy.
Make sure Sheriff Davis gets that.
Tommy's eyes widened as he recognized the face on the poster.
That's Black Jack Wilson. You found his hideout.
Wyatt nodded, his jaw tightening.
Found it, and made sure he knew it wasn't safe no more.
As Tommy scampered off to deliver the poster, Wyatt finished tending to his horse. He murmured soft words of praise, his touch gentle as he brushed down the animal's coat. In these quiet moments, the hard lines of his face softened, revealing a glimpse of the man behind the reputation. The tranquil moment was shattered by a commotion outside. Wyatt's hand flew to his gun as he strode out of the stable, every muscle tense and ready for action. A group of ranch hands were gathered around the breaking pen, shouting and placing bets. In the center, a magnificent black stallion reared and bucked, fighting against the ropes that held it. The horse's wild eyes rolled with fear and fury, its powerful body twisting in desperate attempts to escape.
God damn it, Hank!
Wyatt's voice cut through the noise like a whip crack.
What the hell do you think you're doing?
A burly man with a thick mustache turned, his face red with exertion and anger.
Trying to break this devil horse? What's it look like? Damn beast nearly took off my arm.
Wyatt's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. The frustrated ranch hands, the terrified horse, the cruel bits and spurs lying nearby. Without a word, he vaulted over the fence and into the pen.
Mr. Jameson, be careful.
Someone called out.
That horse is loco.
But Wyatt paid no heed to the warnings. His focus was entirely on the stallion. He approached slowly, his body language open and non-threatening.
Easy there, big fella.
He murmured, his voice low and soothing.
Ain't nobody here gonna hurt you.
The horse's nostrils flared, its ears pinned back in fear and aggression. But something in Wyatt's calm demeanor seemed to reach it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the animal's frantic movements began to still. Wyatt continued his careful approach, speaking in that same gentle tone. To the onlookers, it almost seemed as if he was carrying on a conversation with the horse, understanding its fears and offering reassurance. Finally, he stood beside the great beast. With slow, deliberate movements, he began to undo the ropes that bound it. A collective gasp went up from the crowd.
You can't just let it go.
Hank protested.
That's Widow Jensen's prize stud. Cost her a pretty penny, it did.
Wyatt's gaze never left the horse as he replied,
A broken spirit ain't worth any price, Hank. You can't force trust. Gotta earn it.
As the last rope fell away, the stallion remained still, its sides heaving with exertion. Wyatt placed a hand on its sweaty neck, and for a moment, man and beast stood in perfect harmony. Then, with a gentle pat, Wyatt stepped back.
Go on now.
He said softly.
You're free.
The horse hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of this newfound freedom. Then, with a toss of its magnificent head, it galloped out of the pen and down the street, quickly disappearing from view. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Wyatt turned to face them, his expression unreadable.
Hank,
He said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet morning air.
you owe Widow Jensen an apology and a new horse. And next time you want to break a wild one, you come find me first. Understood?
Hank nodded, thoroughly chastened. As the crowd began to disperse, Wyatt stood alone in the breaking pen, the morning sun casting long shadows across the dusty ground. For a moment, he allowed his carefully maintained facade to slip, the weight of unspoken grief settling heavily on his shoulders. His hand moved unconsciously to the faded photograph he always carried in his breast pocket, right above his heart. He didn't need to look at it to see the smiling faces of his parents and little sister, forever frozen in time. The edges were worn smooth from years of handling, a tangible link to a past he could never reclaim. Wyatt's jaw clenched as he pushed the memories away, burying them deep beneath layers of hard-earned resilience. He had a job to do, a purpose to fulfill. There was no room in his life for softness or vulnerability. With practiced ease, he rebuilt the walls around his heart, squaring his shoulders and setting his face in its familiar, unreadable expression. He strode out of the pen, his spurs jangling with each determined step as he made his way towards the sheriff's office. He had a report to make and a bounty to collect. The wild stallion's hoofbeats still echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of his own untamed spirit. But unlike the horse, Wyatt knew he could never truly be free. His past, his pain, and his duty bound him as surely as any rope. As he walked down the dusty street, the townsfolk nodded respectfully in his direction. To them, he was Wyatt Jameson, the skilled tracker, the fearless protector, the lone wolf. None could see the shadows that lurked behind his eyes, or the scars that ran far deeper than those visible on his weathered hands. Wyatt tipped his hat low, shielding his face from curious glances. In the solitude beneath its brim, he allowed himself one last moment of vulnerability. A single thought echoed in his mind, a whisper so faint he could almost pretend he hadn't heard it. Is this all there is? But as quickly as it came, he dismissed the thought. This was his life, the path he'd chosen, or perhaps the path that had chosen him. Either way, there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, Wyatt straightened his shoulders and pushed open the door to the sheriff's office. He had work to do, and dwelling on what might have been was a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet as he stepped inside, Wyatt couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in Sagebrush Creek. A new chapter was beginning, whether he was ready for it or not. Chapter 3. Storm Shelter. The wagon train rumbled along the dusty trail, a caravan of hope and ambition heading west. Lillian Hawthorne sat primly on the bench of her wagon, still marveling at the vast expanse of sky and land that surrounded them. It was a far cry from the narrow streets and tall buildings of Boston,
You all right there, Miss Hawthorne?
called Mr. Jenkins, the merchant who'd agreed to let her travel with his group.
Storm's brewing up ahead. Might get a mite rough.
I'm fine, thank you. Just admiring the view.
As if on cue, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. The wind picked up, whipping strands of hair free from Lillian's usually neat bun. She clutched her bonnet with one hand, the other gripping the edge of the seat.
We'll stop soon.
Mr. Jenkins assured her,
There's a town not far ahead where we can wait out the storm.
but nature had other plans. With a crack of lightning that split the sky, chaos erupted. Horses neighed in fright, wheels creaked as wagons turned sharply, and Lillian's horse, spooked beyond reason, broke free from its harness and bolted.
Maple?
Lillian cried out, watching helplessly as her horse disappeared into the growing gloom.
Leave her.
Mr. Jenkins shouted over the rising wind,
We need to get to shelter.
but Lillian couldn't bear the thought of abandoning her faithful companion. In a moment of impulse that would have shocked her Boston acquaintances, she leapt from the wagon and ran after Maple. The storm hit in full force as Lillian stumbled across the prairie. Hail pelted down, stinging her exposed skin. She lost all sense of direction, able only to follow the fading sound of Maple's frightened neighs. Just when she thought all hope was lost, Lillian heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. A rider materialized out of the gloom, his hat pulled low against the storm.
Ma'am,
He called out, reining in his horse beside her.
what in tarnation are you doing out here?
Lillian looked up, meeting the concerned gaze of the most ruggedly handsome man she'd ever seen.
My horse.
She managed to say through chattering teeth.
She bolted.
The stranger cursed under his breath, then extended a hand.
No time to search now. Storm's getting worse. There's shelter nearby. Climb on.
Too cold and frightened to argue, Lillian accepted his help. She found herself seated in front of him on his horse, his strong arms on either side of her as he gripped the reins. They rode hard through the worsening storm, hailstones pelting them mercilessly. Finally, the stranger guided them into the mouth of a small cave. As they dismounted in the cave, Lillian tried to smooth her hair and straighten her mud-splattered dress, acutely aware of how disheveled she must look.
Thank you, Mr.
Jameson. Wyatt Jameson.
He replied, tipping his hat. His eyes, a striking green flecked with gold, studied her with a mixture of concern and amusement.
And you are?
Lillian Hawthorne, the new school teacher.
She said, attempting to maintain her dignity despite her bedraggled appearance. Wyatt's eyebrow quirked up.
Bit far from Boston, ain't you, Miss Hawthorne?
Lillian blinked in surprise.
How did you know I'm from Boston?
A ghost of a smile played at the corners of Wyatt's mouth.
Your accent. And the fact that no local would be fool enough to chase after a horse in this weather.
Lillian felt a blush creep up her cheeks, equal parts embarrassment and indignation.
Well, Mr. Jameson, I'll have you know that we Bostonians are quite capable of facing a little inclement weather.
Is that so?
Wyatt chuckled.
Well then, I reckon you won't mind helping me get a fire started. It's gonna be a long night.
As they gathered kindling, Lillian's curiosity got the better of her.
Do you always rescue damsels in distress, Mr. Jameson?
Wyatt snorted.
Only on Tuesdays and every second Friday. You're lucky you caught me on schedule.
Lillian laughed despite herself.
I'll be sure to plan my distress more carefully in the future.
As Wyatt worked on starting the fire, Lillian decided to make herself useful. She spotted some fallen branches just outside the cave entrance that would make good kindling.
Mr. Jameson,
She called out.
I'll gather some more wood for the fire.
Wyatt looked up from his work.
Much obliged, Miss Hawthorne. Just be careful of...
But Lillian was already on her way, determined to prove she wasn't some helpless city girl. She strode purposefully through a patch of lush green plants, reaching for the branches just beyond.
Ouch!
She yelped, feeling a sudden stinging sensation on her ankles and hands. She looked down to see angry red welts forming on her skin. Wyatt was by her side in an instant, gently guiding her away from the plants.
That's poison ivy, Miss Hawthorne. Nasty stuff.
Lillian bit her lip, mortified.
Oh dear, we don't have that in Boston.
No, I reckon you don't.
Wyatt said, his voice softer than before. He rummaged in his saddlebag, producing a small tin of salve. As he carefully applied it to her hands and ankles, Lillian couldn't help but notice how gentle his touch was, despite his rugged appearance.
Thank you.
She murmured, acutely aware of how close they were standing.
I suppose I should have asked for guidance before charging ahead.
Wyatt's eyes met hers, a mix of concern and amusement in their depths.
It's all right. We all have to learn sometime. Just remember, out here, it's best to look before you leap. The West ain't Boston. Everything's got teeth or thorns.
Even you, Mr. Jameson?
The words slipped out before Lillian could stop them. For a moment, Wyatt looked taken aback. Then he grinned, a genuine smile that transformed his face.
Especially me.
As the fire crackled to life, Lillian's eyes adjusted to the dim light. She noticed movement in a shadowy corner and gasped.
Mr. Jameson, look, there are kittens in here. The poor things must be lost.
Before Wyatt could stop her, Lillian had rushed over to the corner, cooing softly.
Here, kitty kitty, don't be afraid.
Miss Hawthorne, wait.
Wyatt's warning came too late. A low, menacing growl filled the cave. Lillian froze, her eyes widening as she realized her mistake. Those weren't kittens. They were mountain lion cubs. In an instant, Wyatt was beside her, his hand on his gun.
Back away slowly.
He murmured.
Don't make any sudden moves.
Heart pounding, Lillian did as she was told. They inched backwards until they were safely on the other side of the fire. For a long moment, they stood in tense silence, watching the shadows for any sign of the mother mountain lion. When it became clear she wasn't in the cave, they both let out a breath.
Kittens, huh?
Wyatt said, shaking his head. Despite herself, Lillian felt a smile tugging at her lips.
Well, they did look rather small and cuddly from a distance.
Remind me to teach you the difference between house cats and wild felines, Miss Hawthorne. Might save your life out here.
As they settled in to wait out the storm, Lillian couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation.
I'm making quite the first impression, aren't I? Chasing horses into storms, walking through poison ivy, trying to pet mountain lions. What's next? Will I mistake a bear for a large dog?
Wyatt's eyes twinkled with mirth.
Don't go giving yourself ideas, Miss Hawthorne. Though I must say, you're livening up what would have been a dull night of storm watching.
Happy to be of service.
Lillian said with a mock curtsy.
Though I do hope my next contribution to the evening's entertainment won't involve mortal peril.
Oh, where's the fun in that?
Wyatt teased. As they bantered, Lillian felt the last of her nervousness melt away. She'd come west seeking adventure and purpose. Looking at Wyatt Jameson's rugged profile in the flickering firelight, she couldn't help but wonder if she might find something more as well. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cave, a different kind of electricity crackled in the air between Wyatt and Lillian. The first sparks of a connection neither of them had been looking for, but both were powerless to ignore. Lillian awoke to the sound of rain pattering against stone. For a moment, she was disoriented, her mind still foggy with sleep. Then she became aware of two things simultaneously. The warm, solid presence she was leaning against, and the strong arm draped protectively around her shoulders. Her eyes flew open, a blush creeping up her cheeks, as she realized she had fallen asleep on Wyatt Jameson's shoulder. She sat up quickly, smoothing her hair and straightening her rumpled dress.
Good morning, Miss Hawthorne.
Wyatt said, his voice gruff but tinged with amusement.
Sleep well?
Mr. Jameson, I'm so sorry.
Lillian stammered, mortified.
I didn't mean to, that is, I never intended.
Wyatt's low chuckle cut through her flustered apology.
No need to apologize. Reckon you needed the rest after all yesterday's excitement.
Lillian noticed the dark circles under Wyatt's eyes and felt a pang of guilt.
Did you sleep at all?
He shook his head.
Someone had to keep watch. Never know what might wander into a cave during a storm.
Mountain lions looking for their cubs, perhaps?
Lillian said with a wry smile, her embarrassment fading. Wyatt's eyes crinkled at the corners.
Among other things. Though I must say, Miss Hawthorne, you're the most dangerous creature I've encountered in these parts.
Lillian arched an eyebrow.
Oh, and how exactly am I dangerous, Mr. Jameson?
For a moment, something flickered in Wyatt's eyes, an intensity that made Lillian's breath catch. But then it was gone, replaced by his usual guarded expression.
Well, between chasing horses into storms and trying to pet wild animals, you're liable to give a man a heart attack,
He said lightly. Lillian laughed, grateful for the break in tension.
I assure you, Mr. Jameson, I don't make a habit of such behavior, though I must admit this has been the most exciting night of my life.
Glad I could oblige.
Wyatt said, tipping his hat. He stood, stretching out muscles stiff from a night of sitting vigil.
The hail's stopped, but the rain's still coming down pretty hard. We should probably think about heading back soon, though. That mama mountain lion is bound to come back for her cubs eventually.
As if on cue, a distant roar echoed through the cave. Lillian's eyes widened, and she scrambled to her feet.
On second thought,
Wyatt said, quickly gathering their belongings.
maybe we should head out now.
As they prepared to brave the rain, Lillian caught Wyatt's arm.
Mr. Jameson,
She said softly.
thank you for everything.
For a moment, Wyatt's carefully maintained facade slipped, and Lillian saw a warmth in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat.
My pleasure, Miss Hawthorne.
He said, his voice oddly gentle. Then, with a mischievous grin, he added,
Though next time you want to spend a night in a cave with me, maybe just ask. No need for all the drama with storms and wild animals.
Lillian felt her face flush even as she laughed.
I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Jameson.
As they rode out into the rain, Lillian holding tight to Wyatt's waist, she couldn't help but smile. Her great Western adventure was off to an exciting start, and something told her that Wyatt Jameson would feature prominently in whatever came next. Chapter 4. Town Troubles. The sun peeked over the horizon, painting Sagebrush Creek in hues of gold and pink. Lillian Hawthorne stood on the boarding house porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands. Her first week in town had been a whirlwind of introductions, settling into her new role as the school teacher and trying, often failing, to navigate the intricacies of frontier life. She sipped her coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. Boston tea, this was not.
Morning, Miss Hawthorne.
A familiar voice called out. Lillian turned to see Wyatt Jameson approaching, looking frustratingly handsome despite the early hour.
Good morning, Mr. Jameson.
She replied, hoping her voice didn't betray the little flip her heart did at the sight of him. Wyatt leaned against the porch railing, his eyes twinkling with amusement.
Still struggling with the coffee, I see.
Not at all. I find it invigorating.
Is that why you're making a face like you just bit into a lemon?
She couldn't help but laugh.
All right, you've caught me. I'm afraid I haven't quite acquired the taste yet.
Tell you what, meet me at the general store in an hour. I'll introduce you to something that might be more to your liking.
Before Lillian could respond, he tipped his hat and strode off down the street. She watched him go, a smile playing on her lips. Despite his gruff exterior, Wyatt had shown her nothing but kindness since their adventure in the cave. Still, she sensed a wall around him, a guardedness that went beyond mere frontier caution. An hour later, Lillian found Wyatt waiting outside the general store. He held up a small burlap sack.
Ever had chicory?
Lillian shook her head.
It's a root. When roasted and ground, it makes a drink similar to coffee, but smoother. Thought you might like to try it.
Touched by his thoughtfulness, Lillian smiled.
Thank you, Mr. Jameson. That's very kind of you.
Something flickered in Wyatt's eyes, but before Lillian could decipher it, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A group of children were gathered around the schoolhouse, shouting and laughing. As Lillian and Wyatt approached, they saw the cause of the excitement. A young calf had somehow wandered into the building and was now stubbornly refusing to leave.
Oh dear.
Lillian murmured.
How on earth did it get in there?
Wyatt chuckled.
Knowing these kids, I'd wager someone left the door open on purpose. Probably thought it'd get them out of lessons for the day.
Lillian squared her shoulders.
Well, we can't have that. Mr. Jameson, would you mind helping me remove our unexpected guest?
With pleasure, Miss Hawthorne.
Lillian stepped into the schoolhouse, Wyatt close behind. The calf stood in the middle of the room, chewing contentedly on what appeared to be a geography textbook.
Oh, no.
Lillian chided, approaching the animal with her hands outstretched.
We don't eat books, little one. Come now, let's get you outside where you belong.
The calf looked up at her, bits of paper hanging from its mouth, and let out a loud, "Moo!" Wyatt chuckled.
I don't think it's too interested in your lesson plan, Miss Hawthorne.
Lillian shot him a playful glare.
Well then, Mr. Jameson, perhaps you'd like to try your hand at bovine persuasion?
Stand back and watch a professional at work.
Wyatt said with a wink. He approached the calf confidently, hands on his hips.
All right, you little troublemaker. Time to mosey on out of here.
The calf tilted its head, regarding Wyatt with big, innocent eyes. Then, quick as a flash, it darted between his legs, causing Wyatt to stumble and nearly fall. Lillian couldn't help but laugh at the sight of the tough cowboy being outmaneuvered by a baby cow.
Oh yes, very professional indeed.
Wyatt straightened his hat, a rueful grin on his face.
Seems this little fella's got some tricks up its sleeve.
Their next attempts fared no better. Lillian tried to lure the calf out with a trail of hay, only to have it eat the bribe and then retreat further into the classroom. Wyatt's attempt to herd it towards the door resulted in the calf leaping onto a desk, sending inkwells flying and splattering both would-be wranglers with black ink.
Oh.
Lillian exclaimed, wiping ink from her cheek and inadvertently smearing it further.
This is not going as planned.
Wyatt, his own face streaked with ink, couldn't help but laugh.
You got a little something.
He gestured vaguely at her face, then realizing the state of his own, joined in her laughter. Their mirth was interrupted by a loud crash. They turned to see the calf had knocked over a bookshelf, sending a cascade of primers and slates to the floor.
This is a disaster.
Lillian moaned, though she couldn't keep the smile from her face.
What do we do now?
Wyatt's eyes twinkled with mischief.
Well, Miss Hawthorne, I reckon it's time for some teamwork. You go left, I'll go right, and we'll corner this little troublemaker.
They spread out, slowly approaching the calf from either side. The animal's head swiveled back and forth between them, as if trying to decide which posed the greater threat.
Easy now.
Lillian cooed, inching forward.
We're not going to hurt you.
That's right.
Wyatt added, his voice uncharacteristically soft.
We're all friends here.
The calf, apparently unconvinced, suddenly bolted forward. Lillian and Wyatt lunged at the same time, colliding with each other and tumbling to the floor in a tangle of limbs as the calf pranced away. Lillian found herself sprawled across Wyatt's chest, their faces inches apart. For a moment, the chaos around them faded away, and she was acutely aware of the warmth of his body, the strength in his arms that had instinctively wrapped around her to break her fall.
Are you all right, Miss Hawthorne?
Wyatt asked, his voice husky. Lillian nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Their eyes locked, and for a heartbeat she thought he might. A loud moo broke the spell. They looked up to see the calf standing over them, looking almost smug.
I think it's laughing at us.
Lillian couldn't help it. The absurdity of the situation, their inglorious sprawl on the floor, the triumphant-looking calf, it was all too much. She burst into laughter, her whole body shaking with mirth. After a moment of surprise, Wyatt joined in, his deep chuckles harmonizing with her giggles. They lay there, a ink-stained, hay-covered mess, laughing like children. Finally, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes, Lillian managed to say,
Well, Mr. Jameson, I don't know about you, but I'm about ready to admit defeat. Perhaps we should offer the calf a position as assistant teacher?
Wyatt grinned, helping her to her feet.
Now that's an idea, though I'm not sure the parents would appreciate their kids learning how to moo instead of read. Not quite what you expected when you came west, is it?
Wyatt called from where he was trying to block the calf's escape through a window. Lillian laughed, a full, joyous sound that seemed to fill the entire schoolhouse.
I must say, Mr. Jameson, life here is certainly never dull.
Finally, through a combination of Wyatt's roping skills and Lillian's quick thinking with a bucket of oats, they managed to lead the calf out of the schoolhouse. The children cheered, thoroughly entertained by the spectacle. As they stood catching their breath, Lillian noticed a rare, unguarded smile on Wyatt's face. For a moment, she glimpsed the man he might have been before whatever tragedy had built those walls around his heart.
Thank you for your help, Mr. Jameson,
she said softly.
I'm not sure what I would have done without you.
Wyatt's smile faded, that familiar guardedness returning to his eyes.
Just doing my civic duty, Miss Hawthorne. Can't have our school teacher wrangling livestock on her own.
Lillian felt a pang of disappointment at his retreat.
Well, nevertheless, I appreciate it. Perhaps you could teach me a thing or two about handling animals. It seems I have a lot to learn about life out here.
Maybe.
Wyatt said noncommittally. He tipped his hat.
I should get going. Got work to do at the ranch.
Lillian watched him go, sighing softly. It was clear that for every step forward they took, something made Wyatt take 2 steps back. One of her students, little Sarah, tugged at her skirt.
Miss Hawthorne, are you sweet on Mr. Jameson?
Lillian felt her cheeks grow warm.
What makes you say that, Sarah?
The little girl shrugged.
You look at him the way my ma looks at Pa, all soft-like.
Well,
Lillian fumbled for words, then knelt down to Sarah's level.
Mr. Jameson is a kind man who's been very helpful to me. That's all.
Sarah nodded sagely.
Ma says Pa was scared of loving her at first, too. Said his heart was all prickly like a cactus. But she wore him down.
As the children filed into the schoolhouse, Lillian remained outside for a moment, lost in thought. Perhaps Sarah's innocent observation held more wisdom than she knew. Wyatt Jameson's heart might indeed be prickly as a cactus, but Lillian was beginning to think it might be worth the effort to break through those thorns. With a determined smile, she turned and entered the schoolhouse. She had a class to teach and a whole new life to figure out, and maybe, just maybe, a cowboy's heart to win. Chapter 5. Walls of Stone. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on Sagebrush Creek as Lillian made her way to the town's small library. She'd volunteered to help catalog a new shipment of books, eager to bring more knowledge to her students. As she rounded the corner, she spotted a familiar figure emerging from the sheriff's office.
Mr. Jameson,
she called out, quickening her pace to catch up with him. Wyatt turned, tipping his hat in greeting.
Miss Hawthorne.
I was hoping I might run into you,
Lillian said, falling into step beside him.
The children have been asking if you might come to the school again. They were quite taken with your roping demonstration last week.
A ghost of a smile played at Wyatt's lips.
Is that so?
Indeed. Young Tommy hasn't stopped practicing with his jump rope since, although I'm not sure Mrs. Jenkins appreciated him lassoing her cat.
Wyatt chuckled, a sound that never failed to warm Lillian's heart.
I'll see what I can do. Been meaning to talk to you about something anyway.
Lillian's pulse quickened.
Oh?
Sheriff's got word of some cattle rustlers operating in the area. Might be heading this way.
Wyatt's expression grew serious.
I want you to be extra careful, especially when you're out at that schoolhouse alone.
I appreciate your concern, Mr. Jameson, but I'm sure I'll be fine. After all, I did survive a night in a cave with mountain lion cubs.
This ain't no joke, Miss Hawthorne,
Wyatt said, his voice taking on a hard edge.
These men are dangerous. They won't think twice about hurting a woman if she gets in their way.
Lillian blinked, taken aback by his sudden intensity.
I understand. I'll be careful.
Wyatt nodded curtly.
See that you do.
Without another word, he strode off, leaving Lillian staring after him in confusion. Later that evening, Lillian sat on the boarding house porch, a book open but unread in her lap. Her mind kept replaying her interaction with Wyatt, trying to understand what had gone wrong.
Penny for your thoughts?
Lillian looked up to see Mrs. Abernathy, the boarding house owner, settling into the chair next to her.
Oh, it's nothing,
Lillian said, forcing a smile.
Just thinking about the day.
Mrs. Abernathy's knowing gaze saw right through her.
Wouldn't happen to be thinking about a certain cowboy, would you?
Lillian felt her cheeks grow warm.
Is it that obvious?
Only to anyone with eyes.
Mrs. Abernathy chuckled.
You two have been dancing around each other for weeks now.
Lillian sighed.
I'm not sure there's any dancing happening at all. Every time I think we're getting closer, he pulls away. Today he was downright cold.
Mrs. Abernathy was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant.
You know, Wyatt Jameson wasn't always the man you see now. There was a time when he was the most open, friendly young man you'd ever meet. Always ready with a smile or a helping hand.
What changed him?
Lillian asked softly.
Tragedy has a way of reshaping a person.
Mrs. Abernathy said,
Wyatt lost his family to outlaws when he was just a boy. Been carrying that weight ever since.
Lillian's heart ached at the thought of a young Wyatt, alone and grief-stricken.
That's terrible, but surely after all this time...
Mrs. Abernathy shook her head.
Some wounds don't heal clean, dear. They leave scars that change a person. Wyatt's built walls around his heart so high and thick, I sometimes wonder if anyone will ever be able to break through.
Lillian thought of Wyatt's rare smiles, the gentleness he showed with animals, the way he'd protected her during the storm.
But there's still goodness in him. I've seen it.
Oh, no doubt about that.
Mrs. Abernathy agreed.
Wyatt's a good man. But loving someone, really letting them in, that takes a kind of courage I'm not sure he has anymore.
The next day, Lillian spotted Wyatt heading towards the livery stable. Gathering her courage, she approached him.
Mr. Jameson,
She called out.
might I have a word?
Wyatt paused, turning to face her.
Miss Hawthorne, what can I do for you?
Lillian took a deep breath.
I wanted to apologize for yesterday. You were right to warn me about the dangers, and I shouldn't have made light of it.
Wyatt's expression softened slightly.
No need to apologize. I shouldn't have been so harsh.
He trailed off, his jaw clenching.
You were worried?
Lillian finished for him.
I understand, and I appreciate it.
For a moment, Wyatt's guard seemed to lower. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that made Lillian's heart ache. She wanted nothing more than to reach out to him, to assure him that he didn't have to face his pain alone. But as quickly as it appeared, the moment passed. Wyatt's expression shuddered, the walls slamming back into place. He shifted his weight, his hand moving to rest on his holstered gun.
Just being careful ain't always enough out here,
he said gruffly.
This ain't Boston. The West can be unforgiving to those who aren't prepared.
Lillian nodded, trying not to show her disappointment at his renewed distance.
I'm learning that every day, Mr. Jameson.
Wyatt seemed to wrestle with himself for a moment before speaking again.
Look, Miss Hawthorne, I was thinking maybe it'd be a good idea if I taught you how to handle a firearm, just in case.
Lillian's eyes widened in surprise.
You mean shoot a gun?
That's generally what firearms are for.
Wyatt said, a hint of his usual dry humor returning.
Nothing fancy. Just enough so you can protect yourself if need be.
The thought of handling a gun both thrilled and terrified Lillian. It was so far removed from her Boston upbringing, yet it represented another step towards truly embracing her new life in the West.
I think that would be wise,
she said finally.
Thank you, Mr. Jameson.
Wyatt nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders.
Good. We'll start tomorrow if you're free. Meet me at the old Miller place just outside town at noon.
With that, he tipped his hat and turned to go. But this time, instead of feeling shut out, Lillian felt a small spark of hope. Wyatt might not be ready to let down his emotional walls, but in his own way, he was reaching out to her. As she watched him walk away, Lillian felt a mix of emotions swirling within her. Sadness for the pain Wyatt carried, frustration at the barriers he'd erected. But underneath it all, a determination began to take root. Wyatt Jameson's heart might be guarded by walls of stone, but Lillian Hawthorne had never been one to back down from a challenge. She'd come west to make a difference, to grow beyond the confines of her Boston upbringing. Perhaps this was part of that journey. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and moments of doubt. But as she turned back towards the schoolhouse, Lillian felt a sense of resolve settle over her. Wyatt Jameson might think his heart was locked away for good, but Lillian was determined to find the key. And maybe, just maybe, learning to shoot would be the first step in that direction. Chapter 6. Aim for the Heart. The noonday sun hung high over the old Miller place as Lillian approached, her heart fluttering with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. She spotted Wyatt leaning against a weathered fence post, his hat tipped low over his eyes. As she drew closer, he straightened, offering a nod and greeting.
Miss Hawthorne?
He said, his voice gruff but not unkind.
Glad you could make it.
Lillian smoothed her skirts, suddenly very aware of how impractical they were for the task at hand.
I appreciate you taking the time to teach me, Mr. Jameson.
Wyatt's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. the ghost of a smile playing on his lips.
Well, can't have our school teacher defenseless out here in the Wild West now, can we?
He led her to a makeshift shooting range he'd set up, tin cans perched on fence posts at varying distances. Lillian eyed the revolver in Wyatt's hand with a mixture of fascination and trepidation.
Now, first things first.
Wyatt began, his tone shifting to one of patient instruction.
A gun ain't a toy. It's a tool, and a dangerous one at that. You treat it with respect, always.
Lillian nodded solemnly, drinking in every word. As Wyatt explained the basics of gun safety and handling, she found herself captivated not just by the lesson, but by the man himself. This was a side of Wyatt she hadn't seen before. Focused, patient, almost gentle. When it came time for Lillian to actually hold the gun, her hands trembled slightly. Wyatt noticed, of course.
It's all right to be nervous.
He said softly.
Means you understand the weight of what you're holding.
He stepped closer, adjusting her grip on the revolver. Lillian was acutely aware of his presence behind her, his arms almost encircling her as he showed her how to aim.
Now take a deep breath.
Wyatt murmured, his voice close to her ear.
Sight down the barrel. When you're ready, squeeze the trigger. Don't pull, squeeze.
Lillian tried to focus on the target, but her mind was a whirlwind of sensations. The warmth of Wyatt's body so close to hers. The smell of leather and sun-warmed skin. The steady timbre of his voice. She squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked in her hand, the report loud in her ears. The tin can remained untouched.
That's all right,
Wyatt said, stepping back. Lillian immediately missed his warmth.
Nobody hits the target their first time. Try again.
As the lesson progressed, Lillian found herself relaxing. The initial nervousness giving way to concentration and determination. She adjusted her stance as Wyatt had shown her, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The can at the far end of the fence remained stubbornly in place.
You're anticipating the recoil.
Wyatt said, his voice low and steady.
Try to relax your shoulders a bit.
Lillian nodded, rolling her shoulders to loosen them. She raised the gun again, trying to focus solely on the target.
That's it,
Wyatt murmured.
Now, when you're ready.
She squeezed the trigger. This time the can wobbled slightly, though it didn't fall.
You clipped it?
Wyatt said, and Lillian could hear the smile in his voice.
Good job. Try again.
Encouraged, Lillian took aim once more. The gun barked, and this time the can flew off the fence post.
I did it!
Lillian exclaimed, turning to Wyatt with a beaming smile. For a moment, Wyatt's usual stoic expression softened, a genuine smile lighting up his features.
Well done, Miss Hawthorne. I reckon you're a natural.
I doubt that very much, Mr. Jameson, but I appreciate the compliment.
Don't sell yourself short,
Wyatt said, gesturing towards the remaining targets.
Let's see if you can do it again.
As they continued, Lillian found herself enjoying the challenge more and more. She listened intently to Wyatt's instructions, soaking in every bit of advice he offered.
Remember?
He said at one point, standing close behind her to adjust her aim.
Breathing is key. Exhale as you squeeze the trigger.
Lillian nodded, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach at his proximity. She focused on her breathing, picturing the bullet's path as Wyatt had taught her. When she fired this time, another can toppled from its perch.
Excellent,
Wyatt said softly, and Lillian felt a thrill run through her at the approval in his voice. As the lesson went on, Lillian's accuracy improved. Each successful shot was met with a quiet word of praise from Wyatt. A good job here, a nicely done there. Though the words were simple, the warmth in his tone made Lillian's heart soar. At one point, after Lillian had managed to hit 3 cans in a row, she turned to find Wyatt watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. There was pride there, certainly, but also something softer, almost wistful.
Mr. Jameson?
She asked.
Is everything all right?
Wyatt seemed to shake himself out of whatever thoughts had gripped him.
Just fine, Miss Hawthorne. You're doing real well. Your students would be proud to see their teacher now.
Lillian laughed.
I'm not sure the school board would approve of me teaching marksmanship alongside arithmetic.
A chuckle escaped Wyatt, the sound rich and warm.
Now that would be a sight to see. Might improve attendance at least.
As they shared a smile, Lillian felt as though something had shifted between them. In teaching her, Wyatt had let down his guard, if only a little. She'd been granted a glimpse of the man behind the stoic exterior, patient, encouraging, even playful at times. It only made Lillian more determined to break through the walls he'd built around his heart. For now, though, she was content to bask in the moment, enjoying this rare, unguarded version of Wyatt Jameson.
Shall we try for the farthest targets?
She asked, emboldened by her success and the easy camaraderie that had developed between them. Wyatt nodded, a glimmer of challenge in his eyes.
Let's see what you can do, Miss Hawthorne.
As Lillian took aim once more, she felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond simply learning to shoot. She was adapting to this new life, facing its challenges head-on, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to find a place in Wyatt's carefully guarded world.
Not bad at all, Miss Hawthorne,
Wyatt said as they wrapped up.
You're a quick study.
Lillian beamed at the compliment.
I had an excellent teacher.
For a moment, the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Wyatt's eyes met hers, and Lillian saw something there. A warmth, a longing, quickly masked but unmistakable. Then, as if catching himself, Wyatt cleared his throat and looked away.
We should head back. Storm's brewing.
Lillian glanced at the clear blue sky, puzzled, but didn't argue. As they walked back towards town, a comfortable silence settled between them.
Mr. Jameson,
Lillian said finally, gathering her courage.
I wanted to thank you, not just for the lesson, but for everything. You've been so kind since I arrived.
Wyatt's step faltered for a moment.
Just doing what anyone would do,
He muttered.
No,
Lillian insisted gently.
not anyone. You.
She saw the conflict play out on Wyatt's face, the desire to accept her words warring with the need to keep his distance.
Miss Hawthorne.
He began, his voice rough with emotion.
I can't.
It's all right.
Lillian said softly, her heart aching for him.
You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that I see you, Wyatt Jameson, the real you.
For a breathless moment, Lillian thought Wyatt might actually open up to her. But then the walls came slamming back into place, almost visible in their intensity.
You don't know me, Miss Hawthorne.
He said, his voice cold.
And trust me, you're better off keeping it that way.
With that, he tipped his hat and strode off, leaving Lillian standing alone on the dusty road. As she watched him go, Lillian felt a familiar mix of frustration and determination well up inside her. She'd seen the real Wyatt today, in his patience during the lesson, in the gentle way he'd guided her hands, in that fleeting moment of vulnerability. But she'd also seen how quickly and fiercely he shut down any attempt at emotional connection. For the first time, Lillian found herself wondering if she was fighting a losing battle. Could a heart so firmly walled off ever truly be reached? The doubts gnawed at her as she made her way back to the boarding house. She'd come to the West full of hope and determination, ready to make a difference. But she hadn't counted on falling for a man who seemed determined to push away any chance at happiness. As she reached the porch, Lillian paused, her hand on the railing. No, she decided. She couldn't give up. Not when she'd seen the goodness in Wyatt, the potential for joy and love buried beneath years of pain. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more moments like today, steps forward, followed by leaps back. But Lillian Hawthorne had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She'd come to the West to grow, to become more than the prim Boston lady she'd been raised to be. Perhaps this, learning to be patient, to love someone despite their flaws and fears, was part of that growth. With a deep breath, Lillian squared her shoulders and entered the boarding house. She had lesson plans to write, a school to run, and a cowboy's heart to win. It was time to get to work. Chapter 7. Echoes of Thunder. The cave loomed before Wyatt, a dark maw in the hillside that brought back memories he'd been trying to suppress. He'd told himself he was just checking the area for signs of the mountain lion and her cubs, but deep down, he knew there was more to it. As he approached the cave entrance, his boot caught on something. Glancing down, he saw a small, leather-bound book half buried in the dust. Wyatt stooped to retrieve it, brushing off the cover to reveal gold leaf lettering, Collected Poems. A frown creased his brow as he flipped open the front cover. There, in neat, feminine script, was a name he knew all too well, Lillian Hawthorne. Wyatt's first instinct was to close the book and return it immediately, but as he turned to leave, a gust of wind ruffled the pages, and a few lines caught his eye. My love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Despite himself, Wyatt found his gaze drawn to the words. He told himself he was just making sure the book wasn't damaged, but soon he was leaning against the cave wall, lost in verses of love, loss, and longing. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, Wyatt finally closed the book, his mind a whirl of emotions he couldn't quite name. With a sigh, he tucked the volume into his saddlebag. He had a delivery to make. The schoolhouse was quiet, the children long gone for the day. Lillian sat at her desk, a stack of essays before her, but her mind was far from the task at hand. Her fingers absently traced the grain of the wooden desk as she gazed out the window at the gathering storm clouds. A low rumble of thunder in the distance made her start. For a moment, she was transported back to that fateful day. The hailstorm, the runaway horse, the cave. Lillian shook her head, trying to dispel the memory, but it lingered, like the scent of rain in the air. She could almost feel the warmth of Wyatt's presence beside her in that cramped cave. Hear the low timbre of his voice as he calmed her fears. A knock at the door jolted her from her reverie.
Miss Hawthorne?
Lillian's heart skipped a beat at the familiar voice. She smoothed her skirts and cleared her throat.
Come in, Mr. Jameson.
Wyatt entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His eyes darted around the room before settling on her, and Lillian couldn't help but notice the tension in his shoulders.
I hope I'm not interrupting,
he said, his voice gruff.
Not at all. What can I do for you?
Wyatt shifted his weight, seemingly uncomfortable.
I wanted to return this,
he said, producing the book from his saddlebag.
Found it back at the cave. Reckon you must have dropped it that day.
Lillian's eyes widened in recognition.
Oh, my book of poems. I thought I'd lost it for good. Thank you for bringing it back.
Wyatt nodded, handing over the volume. Their fingers brushed for a moment, and Lillian felt a jolt of electricity at the contact.
Did you happen to read any of it?
She asked, trying to keep her voice casual. A flicker of something, embarrassment, vulnerability, crossed Wyatt's face.
There was one about a rose and a briar. Spoke of love outlasting death. It was powerful stuff.
Lillian's breath caught in her throat. The poem he described was one of her favorites, a tale of love so strong it defied even the grave, that Wyatt had not only read it, but been moved by it.
It's a beautiful piece,
she said softly.
The idea that love can be that enduring, that transformative.
She trailed off, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. When had Wyatt moved nearer, or had she? For a moment, the air between them seemed charged with electricity, like the storm brewing outside. Wyatt's eyes met hers, and Lillian saw a maelstrom of emotions there. Longing, fear, a spark of something that might have been hope. Then, just as quickly, the walls came back up. Wyatt took a step back, his expression shuddering.
It's just words on a page, Miss Hawthorne. Don't mean nothing in the real world.
The dismissal stung, but Lillian refused to let it show. Instead, she squared her shoulders and met his gaze steadily.
Is that truly what you believe, Mr. Jameson? That love has no place in the real world?
Wyatt's jaw clenched.
I believe the world's a harsh place, Miss Hawthorne. And folks who forget that often end up hurt. Or worse.
The weight of unspoken pain in his words was almost palpable. Lillian's heart ached for him, even as frustration welled up inside her. How could she reach him if he was so determined to push everyone away?
The world can be harsh,
she agreed softly.
But it can also be beautiful, full of joy and wonder and, yes, love, if we let it be.
For a heartbeat, Wyatt's mask slipped. Lillian saw a glimmer of the man she'd glimpsed in the cave, vulnerable, yearning for connection. But before she could reach out, the moment passed.
That's a nice thought,
Wyatt said, his voice flat.
but it ain't real, not out here.
He turned to leave, pausing at the door.
Storm's coming. You should head back to town soon.
As the door closed behind him with a soft click, Lillian remained frozen for a moment, staring at the space Wyatt had occupied. Then, as if a dam had broken, she sprang into motion.
Oh, for heaven's sake,
She exclaimed, pushing back from her desk with enough force to send her chair skittering across the wooden floor. She paced the length of the schoolroom, her skirt swishing angrily around her ankles.
that infuriating man.
Lillian muttered, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. She whirled to face the closed door, as if Wyatt might still be there.
Why can't you see what's right in front of you?
Her voice echoed in the empty classroom, and Lillian felt a flush of embarrassment at her outburst. She pressed her palms to her heated cheeks, taking a deep breath to calm herself. As quickly as her anger had flared, it faded, leaving behind a hollow ache in her chest. Lillian's shoulders slumped, and she leaned heavily against her desk, her fingers tracing the spine of the poetry book.
Am I fooling myself?
She whispered to the empty room, her voice small and uncertain.
Can a heart so guarded ever truly open again?
Lillian picked up the book, flipping through its pages until she found the poem about the rose and the briar. Her vision blurred as she read the familiar lines, a single tear splashing onto the page. With a frustrated groan, she snapped the book shut and pressed it to her chest.
Pull yourself together, Lillian.
She chided herself, straightening her spine and squaring her shoulders. She moved to the window, watching as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The storm outside mirrored the tumult within her heart, and for a moment, Lillian allowed herself to feel the full weight of her doubts and fears. But as a flash of lightning illuminated the schoolyard, Lillian's reflection in the glass caught her eye. She saw not the prim Boston lady she'd once been, but a woman transformed by the challenges and adventures of her new life in the West.
No,
She said firmly, meeting her own gaze in the window.
I won't give up. Not yet.
With renewed determination, Lillian began to gather her things, her movements purposeful and decisive. As she prepared to brave the storm outside, she realized she was steeling herself for more than just rain and wind. The path to Wyatt's heart would be fraught with obstacles, both external and internal. But Lillian Hawthorne had never been one to shy away from a challenge. As she stepped out into the rain, the schoolhouse door locked behind her. Lillian felt a curious mix of doubt and determination settle in her chest. The journey ahead would not be easy, but perhaps, like the rose and briar in the poem, their love, if given the chance to bloom, could be something enduring, something transformative. With that thought to buoy her, Lillian set off towards town, the storm raging around her much like the tumult of emotions within,